Let's get right into it, class. Welcome to this Masterclass Explainer. Now, if you are a KSLU law student sitting for your final constitutional law exams, you really need to pay very close attention right now. The topic on the board today, question 27, Principles or Rules of Constitutional Interpretation, is a guaranteed 16-mark essay question, no doubts about it. Listen, I have evaluated thousands of answer scripts over the years, and I can assure you, your success in this paper absolutely hinges on how meticulously you present this specific topic. So sit up straight, get your bare axe and notebooks ready, and let's dive into this.
All right, this is your mandatory syllabus roadmap and, frankly, your exact exam heading structure. We'll cover 1. The Intro to Constitutional Interpretation. 2. Primary Rules of Interpretation. 3. Doctrines of Legislative Competence. 4. Basic Structure and Precedents. 5. Doctrines of Fundamental Rights. And finally, 6. The Importance and Exam Conclusion.
Starting right off with Section 1, Intro to Constitutional Interpretation. Right, I want you to write this verbatim in your introduction. The Constitution of India is a living document. Its provisions often require interpretation by courts, especially the Supreme Court, to resolve ambiguities and apply them to changing circumstances. Now, let's dissect that phrase for a moment, living document. Please do not just throw this term around casually. To really show conceptual depth to the KSLU evaluator, you need to explain that a constitution is not some fossilized relic, okay? It breathes. It absolutely must respond to the socioeconomic realities of a modern India, things which the Founding Fathers back in 1950 just couldn't have entirely foreseen. Next, you must memorize this definition. Constitutional interpretation refers to the process by which courts explain, clarify, and apply constitutional provisions. Now, class, listen to me carefully here. I want you to explicitly underline those verbs, explain, clarify, and apply, in your exam booklets. The evaluator's eyes are going to scan your page specifically looking for these exact 3 pillars of judicial action. Make it easy for them to give you those marks. Let's move on to Section 2, Primary Rules of Interpretation. First up, the literal rule. This is where words are given their ordinary and natural meaning. It's applied when the language is clear and unambiguous. But contrast this with the golden rule, which modifies literal meaning to avoid absurdity or injustice. So how exactly do you contrast these two in your answers? Well, you explain that under the literal rule, the court is acting strictly as a dictionary. If the text says X, the court enforces X, right? But when applying that exact grammar leads to a ridiculous outcome that Parliament clearly did not intend, well, that's when the court steps in with the golden rule. You absolutely must emphasize this shift from reading the plain text to preventing absurd outcomes if you want to secure full marks here. Next, we have the Mischief Rule. This interprets provisions to suppress the mischief and advance the remedy. It focuses on the purpose of the law. Versus Harmonious Construction, where conflicting provisions are interpreted to give effect to all. It avoids conflict between different parts of the Constitution. Now, take careful note of this deliberate distinction. The Mischief Rule is essentially asking, what disease was this statute trying to cure? It looks at the statutory purpose. Harmonious Construction, on the other hand, is an internal balancing act. For example, if Article 25 gives you freedom of religion, but Article 19 restricts public order, the court must reconcile them. One part of the Constitution simply cannot defeat another part. Write it exactly like that.
Moving on to Section 3, Doctrines of Legislative Competence.
First, here is the doctrine of pith and substance. This looks at the true nature and substance of legislation, and it's used to determine legislative competence. Next is a big one, the doctrine of colorable legislation. The maxim goes, what cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly. It basically prevents the misuse of legislative power. Let's dissect this famous maxim for a second. If the state legislature does not have the power under the state list to tax a certain item, well, they cannot just dress up that tax as a fee to sneak it past the Constitution. That is a fraud on the Constitution. I highly advise you to write that quote, what cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly, in bold or underlined text. Evaluators are always looking for it. Okay, Section 4, Basic Structure and Precedents. Pay close attention here. The doctrine of basic structure. Simply put, the Constitution cannot be amended to destroy its basic structure. Now, this is the foundational rule, but as you all know, a rule in Indian constitutional law means absolutely nothing without the Supreme Court precedent that birthed it. So let us introduce the single most important constitutional precedent in Indian history. Kesavananda v. State of Kerala, AR 1973, SC 1461. Students, put your pens down for a moment and listen to this mandatory deep dive.
You cannot just name-drop this case and expect marks. You must detail the background. His Holiness Kesavananda challenged the Kerala Land Reforms Act under which his mutt's property was being acquired by the government. This case escalated all the way to a 13-judge bench to decide the absolute limits of Parliament's amending power under Article 368. The final ratio decidendi, by a razor-thin 7-6 majority, was profound. They held that Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights. But, and this is a massive but, it cannot alter, destroy, or abrogate the basic structure of the Constitution. So, what is the absolute relevance of this topic? Well, it's the ultimate interpretive limitation on legislative overreach. It means the Constitution's core identity, things like democracy, secularism, judicial review, is completely untouchable. In your exam script, I instruct you to write this case in a separate boxed format to immediately capture the evaluator's attention. Now, observe the historical shift here. A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras shows the court initially adopting a strict, literal interpretation of fundamental rights. But this approach radically changed in subsequent cases, specifically in Maneka Gandhi.
Here is your mandatory case breakdown for this specific transition. First, A.K. Gopalan v. State of Madras, 1950. The background here is that Gopalan was detained under the Preventive Detention Act, and he argued his detention violated his rights. The ratio decidendi here was a very strict, rigid, literal interpretation. The court held that procedure established by law in Article 21 simply meant any validly enacted state law could take away your life for liberty, even if that law was completely unfair. Now, contrast this with Maneka Gandhi v. Union of India, 1978. The facts? The government arbitrarily impounded her passport without giving her a hearing. So the Supreme Court completely overruled the old Gopalan logic. The ratio decidendi in Maneka Gandhi established that the procedure depriving you of personal liberty must be fair, just, and reasonable, not arbitrary or oppressive. The absolute relevance here is that it clearly shows the Supreme Court abandoning that narrow literal rule and adopting a broad, substantive interpretation of fundamental rights. Make sure you underline these case names side by side to secure those 16 marks. You have to show the evaluator you actually understand the evolution of the law.
Let's move to Section 5, Doctrines of Fundamental Rights. The doctrine of eclipse dictates that laws inconsistent with fundamental rights become inoperative, not void, versus the doctrine of severability, where only the invalid part of a law is struck down, not the whole law. Now, class, whatever you do, do not mix up these terms. Under the doctrine of eclipse, a pre-constitutional law that violates a fundamental right is not dead. It is merely overshadowed. It's inoperative. Essentially, it's sleeping. If a constitutional amendment removes that fundamental right hurdle later on, the law wakes up and becomes active again. Under severability, on the other hand, if Section 2 of an act violates the Constitution, but the rest of the act is totally fine, the court takes a judicial scalpel, cuts out the struck-down invalid part, and saves the rest of the law. Remember it like this. Eclipse is about sleeping laws. Severability is about amputating the bad parts. Be very explicit about this distinction. Then we have the doctrine of progressive or liberal interpretation. This means the Constitution is interpreted in a broad and dynamic manner to adapt to changing social conditions. Now, let me deliberately connect this progressive interpretation doctrine back to the very first point we made today. Do you remember the phrase living document? This doctrine is exactly the legal tool the courts use to keep the document alive. Making this connection on paper shows a cohesive, well-thought-out exam narrative. It proves you aren't just reciting facts, but that you truly understand the constitutional system.
And finally, Section 6, Importance and Exam Conclusion.
When you are summarizing the importance of interpretation, format your answer clearly. Look at this matrix. Application ensures proper application of the Constitution. Organs of government maintains balance between them. Rights protects our fundamental rights, and society promotes overall justice and fairness. I am advising you very strongly here, draw this exact matrix, this exact tabular format right there in your answer scripts. KSLU evaluators highly reward structured tabular data because it breaks up those massive walls of text and clearly demonstrates your clarity of thought.
Finally, here is your exact conclusion. The principles of constitutional interpretation enable courts to preserve the spirit of the Constitution while adapting it to modern needs. They ensure that the Constitution remains flexible yet stable, safeguarding democracy. Just look at how these specific words summarize your entire essay. The phrase flexible yet stable perfectly encapsulates the constant tension between the literal rule and progressive interpretation. Writing this demonstrates total mastery over the subject matter.
As we close the books on this syllabus topic, I want to step away from the strict exam preparation for just a second. I have a question for you.
If the Constitution is indeed a living document, will our current rules of interpretation be enough to safeguard democracy against the unforeseen challenges of tomorrow? Think about digital privacy, artificial intelligence, or even climate change. It is a profound thought. As future lawyers standing in the Supreme Court, it's going to be up to you to argue for the next evolution of these rules. Study hard, structure your answers well, and I will see you in the next class.